Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 132 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and now over 350 partnering organizations from around the world that arose in the midst of this pandemic we're all going through as an offering to people globally to come together on a daily basis to share what it's like going through this extraordinary rite of passage and crisis of the human race, and to share experiences and solutions, confer as to how we can increase our strategic effectiveness to ensure that the world beyond the pandemic is more sustainable and resilient and abundant and healthy and in alignment with natural systems. As I've mentioned, one of the advantages of doing the summit in an ongoing way is we get to keep up with world events. And 2 days ago, on Tuesday, the 3rd of November, the United States had an election, which is not over yet. So we've dedicated this whole week to a contemplation of the consequences of the recent election in the United States on not only the future of the United States, but its impact around the world. And we will get to the program in a minute, but why don't we just start, as we always do, with a minute of just pause and take a few deep breaths and place your attention on your heart in a spirit of thanksgiving and gratitude that you're alive at this unbelievable moment in human history. One minute. Thank you, everyone. It's always good to start anything with a coherent heart. And it only takes a minute. It's quite extraordinary how the heart can attune one's whole body and your emotions and calm the mind just by listening to your heartbeat. I want to welcome all of you, and in particular, I want to welcome our contributors today. We have two interactive themes. One is that we're going to be listening to two millennials extraordinaire, Jack Policar and Max Perrey. Jack, I've known for many, many years. He went to school with my two sons in Mill Valley, and is a friend of the family and friend of the community. And Has been in and out of ubiquity, contributing mightily. He's I would say, a serial entrepreneur that is now the chief operating officer of a company called Food, and is also involved in probably 10 or 15 or 20 other things, because that's the nature of his personality and his kinetic energy, very politically aware. And Max Perrey, same generation and cohort, graduated the best in his class in politics at UC Santa Cruz, where my youngest son, Zach, went, and beautiful, beautiful campus on the coast of California. And then Max went off to the London School of Economics, where he got a master's degree in European studies, set up an organization to look into pan-European politics, has been now very active in local politics in Mill Valley, California, just north of San Francisco, and was the runner-up in the recent election to the city council. He's been advising candidates, been very active in the Democratic National Party, and is really, an up-and-coming political consultant and operative in the state of California, with national and global knowledge and ambitions. So that's going to be part of what we want to explore today. What's it like coming of age in a time of Trump? The other thing we want to explore is how we all take in that, just like this election this week and all the turbulence that's gone on around the election. And that's just one turbulence. We've got the pandemic, we've got the lockdown, we've got social distancing, we've got cultural upheaval worldwide, ecological devastation. How do we navigate through chaos? And so we've invited Carolyn Baker, who is a scholar and has written a number of books on this whole domain. I just wanted to give us a quick list. Love in an Age of Ecological Apocalypse, Navigating the Coming Chaos, Savage Grace, Living Resiliently, Collapsing Consciously, Sacred Demise, and with Andrew Harvey, and the book just published this month called Radical Regeneration. So we want to touch on the larger theme of how we keep heart coherence. How do we keep our equilibrium in a world that is full of ricocheting turbulence at every level, every day? So that's the agenda for our session on day 132. But we want to start, as we've done since Monday, with Shelly Alcorn, who is I would say our political reporter and commentator, who will report the latest updates on the US election. Shelly?
Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm happy that you're here and joining us on this Thursday in November. I think one of the shows that I like is from the UK. It's called Doctor Who. And at one point, Doctor Who had said, rest is for the weary, sleep is for the dead. I'm sure that's probably something that's been said by many, many people throughout the years, but that seems to be the theme for this week. If you'll remember on Monday, we talked about this idea of the marathon that we're running. And we are running a marathon with this election and with the process that we will continue to go through through January of 2020. That being said, it's nice to have a little bit of a break today from some of the tension. There's a bit of an energetic shift in the United States. Things are a little less tense today than they have been. And I think that is really good. So let's take a breath and continue to wait and continue to see what happens. Obviously, I have a preferred candidate. I have never tried to hide that. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a preference. But I want to remind everybody that my critique is based on authoritarianism and on political processes. So yes, I am gratified to see that Biden is holding the line, it looks like. It still could go either way. But my critique is based on the sort of the 5-point strategy that had been laid out before the election. And we're seeing how that 5-point strategy has been playing out this week. So let's go back and review that. Number one, there has been a tactic authoritarians use to delegitimize the vote. And we're still seeing that on Twitter. We're seeing a lot of emotion around the votes are being stolen, the votes shouldn't be counted. There's just a lot of continued talk about that. I think it is a good sign, and I have appreciated the sign that some of the major Republican leaders who don't usually contradict Mr. Trump, such as Mitch McConnell, who just won his election, etc., are saying things like, no, we need to finish the count. No, this is how elections work. I think that's a good sign that some of his supporters in the Republican establishment are at least publicly saying, we need to let the process finish. I think that's a good sign. I think we should hold on to that. The second tactic is deter and suppress the vote through intimidation and bullying. We have been seeing some of that, not as much as we may have expected. There were armed protesters who showed up in Arizona, about 200, chanting "Stop the Vote" in Arizona. Other supporters in Michigan have showed up with "Stop the Vote" kind of protests. These things have been sporadic and have been sort of focused on different areas. So there's still some of that going on, but not to the level with which we might have expected to see it. The third component was contested with legal challenges. That is certainly happening, and that is not a surprise. Many lawsuits have been filed in many different jurisdictions, whether they're counties, states, or federal. Most of them so far have been relatively technical, relatively specious in a way, that the vote has been tainted because observers had to stand 6 feet away versus 3 feet away, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of that isn't necessarily serious. The Trump administration has gone back to the Supreme Court to revisit their decision to allow Pennsylvania to continue to accept ballots 3 days after the election, which was put in place by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Court watchers who watch SCOTUS pretty carefully say there doesn't seem to be a big move on the part of SCOTUS to interfere at this point. So that is still an outstanding question as to whether they will and to what level they will will take that case back up. It is still open. For arm twist electors, we have not entered that phase yet. That phase is going to happen once the election is called overall. So I think that still waits to be seen. And remember, we have 6 weeks to go on that. So let's continue to pray that cooler heads will prevail and that the system will continue to work and that some of this will be fine. Fifth is count on and call for political violence. There have been sporadic protests over the past 24 hours in several cities. Protect the Vote had seemed to be ginning up a lot of protests on the 4th. Didn't seem to happen to the level that they wanted it to happen, Protect the Vote. But there were some protests in Chicago, other cities, Portland, that have sort of been ongoing for this year. We have seen what we would call a normal amount of police violence and arrests, what we refer to as normal now in the United States. So there haven't been any particular major events attempting to stop protest. There's a large protest being called for, a solidarity protest on Saturday. So we'll see how those play out. Right now, Wisconsin and Michigan have been called for Vice President Biden. In Arizona, one outlet has called for Biden. The AP has called for that. However, the New York Times and the rest of the majors have not concurred with AP right now, so that's simply a rumor. Nevada and Georgia may announce their results today. Pennsylvania and North Carolina are still lagging. Pennsylvania says they may be able to announce on Friday what their final results were. There have been a lot of questions I've been getting from people as to why do some states count ballots before the election and some states count mail-in and absentee ballots after the election. A lot of that depends on the legislatures that are in control of the state election boards and county election boards in each individual state. Back earlier this year, there were a number of attempts to change election rules because they knew that mail-in ballots due to the pandemic were going to be much higher than usual. Absentee ballots are going to be much higher than usual in a number of states to allow those states to begin to count those votes as they came in. A lot of those states do that, have always done that. Some states decided that they would do that because of the pandemic this year. And then there were many states that were controlled by the Republican state legislatures that said no, that they have to be counted after 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. on election day, specifically to set up the scenario that we have in front of us. So let's not think that there isn't some amount of thinking going on in the background. So that's where we stand today in the United States. We can take a breather, I think. Let's wait. The process will continue. Protests so far are sporadic. Violence has been low. We don't know what will happen when the final call comes through. And of course, nothing is final until the Electoral College votes in December. So there will be some attempts, I believe, to subvert the process after this. How much traction they're going to get on those events seem a little more questionable now than they may have last week, and I'm very happy about that. One last thing that I'd like to say today before we wrap, we'll have sort of a final wrap up tomorrow. I just saw on Twitter that the Harvard Book Store is having a discussion this afternoon with Dr. Timothy Snyder and with several other folks happening at 4:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 Pacific Time. I'm going to put that link for you in the chat. You can register for free to watch that, and I highly encourage you to do so. We've been talking about Dr. Snyder's work that I have been following very, very closely for many, many years. And I am going to be interested in watching and hearing what he has to say about how this process is unfolded. So I'll put that link in the chat for you. Thank you very much for being here. We always appreciate you. I appreciate that you're here and that you're allowing us to take this more technical look at how democracy works in America. And let's move on. And I'm looking very forward to hearing what our panelists say. So thank you very much.
Shelly, before you go, I'd love to ask you just one question about your sense of the integrity of the vote counting process. You know, it's one thing to manipulate Facebook and Twitter and kind of social media generally with fake news and egregious distortions of fact about various candidates. But the bottom line is to ensure that the vote goes your way. And we've got all these voting machines that are easily hackable. It would seem to me that if the Trump campaign and the Russians wanted to really hack the election, they would be hacking the mechanisms of actually counting the votes. Is it your sense that that has not happened? I mean, what would your perspective be on that possibility?
Thanks for that. That's a good question. In the lead up to the election, there was a lot of concern on the part of our intelligence agencies and the CIA regarding exactly that, the electronic infrastructure that's used to support the election. We have in the past had problems in the United States with voting machines that had been hacked or had been changed. It's quite easy for people to do that. And after repeated requests over the last 3 or 4 years, there was no additional funding given to states to directly address that issue. So I believe that it is possible that there have been instances like that. So far, the FBI and the intelligence agencies in the United States are saying that the cyber attacks that they expected to materialize earlier this week don't seem to have happened. I know they're all auditing the process. I know they're all really watching very carefully to see what's happening with that. If they do find instances of that, I think that could be used by either campaign to talk about the vote and the validity of the vote. I think there are going to be arguments about that. But up until now, there haven't been a lot of reports or a lot of chatter from the intelligence communities that something like that is happening. The vote counts themselves, it's very hard to, because of the decentralized nature of the elections in the United States, it's very hard to miscount the votes to make a significant difference in a statewide election, because they're all counted at the county level, and every state has multiple county people in it. A lot of counties have observers, like my county, Amador County. They have a window that citizens can go sit behind and watch the vote, watch the count, to make sure that things seem to be being handled correctly. They do have audit procedures. There are recounts that can happen. Pennsylvania, for their part, after all the criticism they've been getting this week, they've set up a live stream camera so that you can go watch with a live stream camera what's happening in Pennsylvania. So the weaknesses that existed and do exist have either been repaired to the point, or we didn't have the types of attacks that we expected to have. That being said, everything depends on who actually is judged to have won the election, and then we'll see what happens after that. But for right now, it seems okay. It seems okay. Carolyn Baker made a really good point there. Cheating results from voter suppression. And we can absolutely say that there has been voter suppression this year. Absolutely. Particularly with BIPOC and communities of color. Let's not kid ourselves. It was very, very difficult for communities of color to vote. As we mentioned before, closing polling places, closing election places, et cetera, et cetera. So the vote that was suppressed, yes, we had a large degree of voter suppression in the United States. It is people of color who are going to carry the day for us in the United States should Biden actually win the election. So let's be grateful for those who stood in line for 10 hours, 12 hours, and did what they could to support democracy.
And you know, Beverly Sullivan is making the point that voting machines are not connected to the internet, so they cannot be hacked. Is that your understanding?
It depends. Some are, some aren't. They were more likely to have been connected to the internet in 2016 and before. There were a number of counties and states that sort of pulled that back and removed their machines from the internet. However, there's still the possibility in some jurisdictions that they are connected to the internet. So it kind of depends. It kind of depends.
And then Jane was asking the question, do all counties have the same number and kinds of checks and balances?
No. And that's one of the things that makes the United States incredibly complicated. I wish that they did, but no, they don't. It very much varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I hope that we could have a discussion in the United States about how elections are conducted, what best practices are, and that we had some uniform expectations, and that we didn't have this sort of Wild West situation that we have.
Mhm.
But that's a conversation that needs to be had in states and with the feds. And I doubt that we're ever going to have it, but I hope so. so,
Well, good. Well,
so
thank you so much. And as we progress this conversation, feel free to drop in and make any comments or ask any questions that you would like.
thank you.
Jack and Max and Carolyn, please join me and turn on your videos. And let's start with Jack and Max, two young men in America growing up in a time of Trump. You know, I'm one of the boomers. I grew up in the time of the Kennedys and, the assassination of the two Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Vietnam War. And that's what shaped my worldview. And I think Carolyn's. And that's how we came of age. It was sort of this ethos of complete possibility and cynical cutting down of brilliance. And that shaped my generation, at least in the United States, the student movement and all of that. So Jack first, and then Max, tell us what is it like for you growing up in a time of Trump?
Really, it's been wild. I think 2016, I was actually working for the election, working for a volunteer organization in Denver, Colorado, and I was canvassing. And it was one of those times where it was like, oh, Hillary's going to win. This is a shoo-in. There's no question. Look at the polls. Look at the people. This guy. I mean, people were literally saying, look, this guy's a clown. And I grew up in the Bay Area, so most of my connection, my family, everybody was in the Bay, and they were just sort of hammering home this sentiment of there's no way, this is a joke. Like, what were the Republicans thinking? And I was like, as I kept canvassing, I was like, that's not what they're saying in Colorado. Like, I'm canvassing outside of Denver, and people are like, oh, if you're not here for Trump, you can get off my property. And I was like, wow, like and I started to see the beginning of the divisiveness, the separation, the really, really, really different views. And of course, he won in 2016, and I think that shocked everybody. I mean, people sort of make a joke about it now, like, oh, the liberal snowflakes crying at the 2016 election. But I don't think it was that much of a joke. I think people were shocked and really stunned that someone with his background and sort of track record was being elected to the highest position in the United States, really in the world, and more shocked that there were that many people in the United States who really supported the rhetoric that he was putting out in 2016. And I think for me that there was hope that that shock would subside and that he may actually maybe surprise some people and do things that he wasn't sort of talking about. But I think it went the other way. I think the shock and surprise has continued the 4 years to just almost being numb to the things he's done. And I think that's really where I am deeply afraid, because I think things have changed in the United States in the last 4 years to where information is now questioned at every step by every side. I have very liberal friends, very conservative friends, and I would say the general sentiment now is, oh, I don't trust anything I read. I don't trust anything I see on TV. I don't trust anything I see on social media anymore. And that's terrifying. I mean, I'm having conversations with close friends of like, how do we find truth? How do we find these things that we really believe in? But then how do we deal with, once we do have that center of truth, how do we move from there? And an example for me is climate change. Climate change is one of the things that I'm the most focused on in my life and the most passionate about, and I see as one of the most dire situations. And it really does stack above all of these social issues that to me are very important, but if we don't start working with climate change, it doesn't matter the color of your skin, your religion, your orientation, any of that. We're going to be dealing with a lot bigger issues. And again, that's my opinion and the way that I see the world moving forward. But it's really scary that climate change, to me, has become an opinion for people, because to me it's not. It's science, it is logic, it is fact. But the fact that there are conversations out there that are happening that discredit, to me, what are complete truths, that's been something that's really, really hard for me to grapple with. And I think that's at the core of dealing with these 4 years, and seeing how he has approached being president has really fundamentally changed the fabric of the United States and the world, but also brought out this undercurrent of thought and sort of idealism that may have already been there, and he's just brought it to the surface. So yeah, that's sort of my quick take. Max, I'd love to hear what you have to say on that.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim, for the question, and thanks, Jack, for your thoughts. I mean, I think we do live, as Jack referenced, in such a divisive time. But just taking a step back and looking at the entirety of Europe, I mean, we in some ways are following in the footsteps of trends in the last 5 to 10 years in Western Europe. We saw Brexit, of course. Previously, we've also seen, in France, where the two major parties have essentially disintegrated, where in the last election, Emmanuel Macron came in first, and the person who came in second came from the far right. The two main parties, the center left and the center right, were viewed as not viable options to fix the challenges that the French people felt needed to be fixed. And so they elected to have as their two choices in their general election, two people who were viewed as being from the outside, with different approaches, with different parties, with different figures, and ultimately Macron, as a disruptor, a centrist disruptor, so to speak, came in first, and has pulled people from different parties into a governing coalition. But I think we have seen in the United States the continuation of our two-party system, where our country did not start with Democrats and Republicans, but over my lifetime and my parents and grandparents' generations, has increasingly become hyper-partisan, where people identify with their political party almost as if it's a religion, right? And it is so difficult for people to vote for someone of the other party that even in states where the Senate candidate and the governor candidate and the presidential candidate have won from different parties, the margins are so slim, and the amount of people who have voted for, let's say, a Democrat to be president, but the Republican to be governor, that's decreasingly happening. And if you actually look at the results from this election in terms of local and state elections, the Republicans absolutely swept, right? We picked up a Republican governor. Well, the Republicans picked up a Republican governor seat in Montana. State legislatures that the Democrats planned to take went to Republicans. And those are critical down ballot races because those are the determinants not only of many policy areas and administration of funds from the federal government, but it's also who's going to draw the lines to determine the congressional districts and the state legislature districts and the local districts for the next decade after our census is completed. And So we have, essentially seen a Republican sweep in this election, which will result in a permanent lock on the levers of power when those districts are drawn in the next 2 years. The Democrats picked up, I believe, 0 state legislatures and 0 governorships, despite there being multiple blue state governors on the ballot, for example, in New Hampshire and Vermont. So, I think that, it tells kind of two stories there. One, there was some vote splitting, but it did not go to the benefit of Democrats in that regard. Maybe it did in Georgia, we will see. But otherwise, where the Democrats won, they won at every level. And, in terms of the Republican Party, they have done a superb job of out-organizing the Democrats. And I think it goes without saying that this was a different election from 2016, in large part due to the situation with the pandemic. But if you look at, the tactics that the 2 presidential campaigns took, Trump was often ridiculing Biden for staying in his basement, and that's pretty much just the rhetoric. He was out actually campaigning, and even when he did spend a couple of months at his makeshift campaign headquarters in his home in Delaware, which was the right thing to do, right, given the pandemic, he was meeting with people all over via Zoom. But if you look at the actual organizing tactics that the party took, there was a big difference, right? The Republican campaign, when it knocked on doors in all of the states, that's normally an activity that Democrats do better than Republicans, right? They were super engaged in-person gatherings, right? So they were having rallies, and of course, us progressives, and I'm a progressive and someone who obviously cares about public health, would look and say, oh my gosh, look at this super spreader event that's, going to result in human suffering and even death, right? Unnecessarily. But they were able to, the Republican Party was able to generate enthusiasm and also outreach to voters in ways that the Democrats left on the table due to the pandemic. And the Democrats, essentially were relegated to online outreach, texting, phone banking, and TV ads. And while those are all important tools, it's there's nothing that beats kind of an in-person, outreach plan. So I think those are some initial thoughts on what we're seeing, but I think as Shelly astutely said, it's coming down to a couple of states. It's coming down to Nevada and Arizona in the West, and Georgia in the Southeast, and Pennsylvania in the Midwest. That's where it's coming down. I think from what I've seen, it looks like Georgia, unfortunately for me as a Democrat, is trending. It's trending towards Biden, which is a good thing. But the votes that are coming in more recently are trending towards Trump, and so it's just getting narrower and narrower. And we'll see if Trump catches Biden. In Georgia, it's the exact opposite. Trump is ahead, but it's trending towards Biden. So, and Nevada has been counting their ballots much slower than the other states, which is more a reflection on the fact that we do elections locally in the United States in a decentralized way than anything else. And as we get those final results and in these 4 states, we'll know a lot more.
Good. Well, thank you, Max and Jack. Let me tease out 2 issues, which I think are really important from what both of you have said. First, a comment that you were making, Jack, about, what is truth, and the imperative around climate change as a fact, not an opinion. And it's worth noting that Trump's attitude toward climate change is mirrored by his attitude toward the pandemic. Basically, a negation of science, a negation of the reality that climate change exists, and a negation of science and the reality of COVID-19 in relationship to everything that our public health officials, Dr. Fauci, the World Health Organization, and just about every health official in the world. The United States is the only country on earth that is engaging in an official policy of what they call herd immunity. They're not trying to do anything about the pandemic at all because they don't really believe it. So part of what's happening in your world and in the world generally, and it's not just social media, is a mentality that deliberately turns reality upside down. And, like in George Orwell in 1984, where peace is war and war and peace, and truth is the lie and the lie is the truth. By deliberate policy formation by the governing elites. And I think that's worth contemplating for a moment. And the second point, which I'd love both of you to comment on, and then we'll bring Carolyn in, is your point, Max. The most devastating thing about this election is that Trump and the Republicans didn't lose by a massive landslide. And that's an extension of the first point that I'm making. We have had 4 years of daily outrages by Donald Trump in contradiction to everything that civil society or ethical governance or common sense would dictate. He has violated in the most corrupt administration in US history, acting as an asset to Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin, working with the Russians to subvert the 2016 election and again the 2020 election, and racism, sexism, division, hatred spewing out of his mouth. And yet when it came time to vote, what is it, 48, 49% of the American people consciously, in full awareness of who this guy is, voted for him. And as you say, Max, the understory of this election is that the Republicans won across the board, even took seats from Democrats in the House of Representatives. So the question I want to pose to both of you is how do you square that circle? What is truth in a world in which the deliberate administrative policy is to turn it on its head? And also in a world where just under 50%, and depending on the level, whether it's local, state, or national, more than 50% of one of the most well-educated countries in the history of the world with a democratic tradition that goes back 250 years, believe that and go along with it, hook, line, and sinker, with passionate enthusiasm. How do you understand that?
Absolutely. So I do a lot of thinking on this. And so to answer the first part about misinformation and the struggle to find truth, and sort of your question of how do we square the circle and really find a way to really combat this. I think there are really bright minds trying to actively figure out how we fix disinformation. But to me, and again, in the conversations I'm having with my peers, I think the real beginning of this is understanding the apparatus or the engine that is spurring this on. And I think there's two pieces. I think one, this is a much longer conversation, but getting into capitalism and getting into this sort of manifest destiny idea of I have the given right to pursue everything in my means to be as rich and powerful as possible and go after all of this with limited constraints. And I think when you look at that and you look at the engine that has been created by social media, by the 24-hour news cycle, I think if you track those inflections in history, then you really start seeing society changing with the way that it thinks. And it used to be you got your news from one newspaper, you had two channels on your TV. Now you have 24-hour news cycles at hundreds of different channels. You have the internet, which is such a terrifying tool. But now you have these mega corporations and companies like Google and Facebook who literally profit off of the transfer of information. And it's a terrifying, terrifying tool. I would suggest anybody who hasn't seen The Social Dilemma to go and watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix.
Very important.
To me, it has done the best job of breaking down how misinformation works through the social media engines and sort of creating these multi-billion-dollar companies that will probably all be trillion-dollar companies at some point that are fed off of feeding a certain narrative, and that narrative may not always be true, and they don't have checks and balances to keep them in control or motivate them to tell a factual story. So I think those are two really important pieces to look at of when our generation is looking at how do we move forward, how do we find that truth? We have to really understand that engine. We have to really understand what is broken so we can move forward to, one, try to fix it, but create a better system that we can find out exactly what is going on, where it's going on. And I think that sort of all ties into where we are as a country when we're looking at how many people in this country believe in what Trump believes in. I've always tried being really empathetic and figuring it out. And the best thing that I've figured out is there actually is from what I found, a smaller minority of the people who believe his really, to me, disgusting rhetoric of his bigotry, his racism, his just blind awareness of humanity in general. But those people are really loud and they get a lot of publicity. The people driving down the highway in their massive trucks with the Confederate flag next to a Trump flag, next to an American flag, we see that as horrible and disgusting, but that gets a lot of publicity. The real Trump supporters that I have spoken with, and even friends of mine who have supported him, it's really for these financial things that he talks about. He talks about the economy. He talks about how great the stock market is doing. He's talking about tax cuts. He doesn't want to raise your taxes. And I think there's a lot of people who either have felt cheated in the United States and like they haven't been given the chance. And when Trump talks about, oh, we're going to make it easy for everybody to become rich, they want to believe that. They really want to believe that. And then when they hear Biden and he's talking about we need to take responsibility and we need to look at better tax plans, they're like, oh, that means more taxes. And there's so little education around all of that they just latch on to these small sound bites. And again, really, my deep down feeling and understanding of all of this is if we don't start addressing how to create a more sustainable version of capitalism, then that is at the root of a majority of these problems. Again, looping this back to climate change. Climate change has been accelerated at every stage in history with sort of more of these industrial gains. You look at industrial agriculture, industrialization of the United States, of transportation, of travel. And at every step that we make a big gain there, that's a big step back for the environment. So again, I'll keep it short, leave it there. Max would love to hear what you have to say on that. But yeah, I'm trying to be hopeful, but things are a little scary right now. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it
Well,
at
thank
that.
you, Jack.
Of course.
Max?
Yeah, well, I was just reading all of the excellent, astute comments and questions in the chat. I think that, you know, where this conversation has gone into the nature of truth and you know, ethics, you know, and some of these deeper values is where we do have to look, you know, as a country. And I think that, you know, we have to remember, you know, that there is, you know, partisanship, and those that vote outside the two-party system, especially at the presidential level, is very slim. Those who identify as Republican are probably going to vote for a Republican no matter who the Republican is on the ballot. Those who are Democrats are going to show up and vote for Democrats. And, you know, I've, you know, only been able, you know, as a young adult to vote in 3 presidential elections at this point, but I never contemplated voting for, you know, Mitt Romney either, right? So, you know, even when there's a more moderate or appealing figure on the other side, I'm going to probably stick with the person who shares my party registration. And so, you know, whether it had been, you know, Trump or Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or any of the others who ran in 2016, most of the Republicans on election day were going to show up and vote for the person who won their party's nomination. There is a very slim amount of people who are undecided and choosing between the 2 candidates. But what's more important is whether or not people stay home. And you know, obviously some people choose to vote for a third party, but that's a very small minority of voters as well. And so it's really, you know, are people showing up and actually casting a vote, or are they not? And Democrats and Republicans, I think, but you know, what I'm more familiar with obviously is the Democratic Party, you know, has changed its tactics in the last couple of decades to be less about persuasion and more about driving turnout, right? So you see these large get out the vote operations. Those of us who have shared our phone number at some point with someone, which is pretty much everyone, and is registered as a Democrat, you know, have been bombarded by text messages this cycle, and in previous cycles, it's been, you know, if you live in a swing state, it's mailers and it's phone calls and it's people knocking on your door telling you to go out and vote, right? They're not even saying you have to go vote for Biden because they know you're a Democrat, so they know you are going to vote for Biden because of partisanship or you're more inclined to. They're just telling you to go vote, and they're asking you what your voting plan is, and they're asking if you can, you know, if you need to ride to the polls. I mean, it's actually a very positive attribute because rather than getting into arguments with people, you're just as a volunteer or a staff member on a campaign, you're just helping people vote, which is a really nice thing. But it does mean that we're not spending a lot of time and money and volunteer energy on persuasion. And so this margin of people that's truly undecided gets smaller and smaller every election. And yes, there are very high profile Republicans from years past, right? You know, most of them from 10 plus years ago when they were relevant on the national stage, who have broken with Trump, right? And that's, you know, always the case in every election. This election, it's been more than usual, especially from foreign policy, you know, establishment Republican thinking, you know, veterans of the Reagan and Bush Sr. and George W. Administrations breaking with Trump and either backing Biden or forming groups to say we don't like Trump, even if they don't say who they're for. But that's kind of an elite, few people who represent a thinking that has been of a Republican Party in the past. And every year there's people who pass away, and there's people who become 18 and can vote, and there's people who are disenfranchised for various reasons. So the voting population is constantly shifting. But the change of Republicans to Democrats is actually was always going to be relatively small compared to what some in the media talked about of people, really, saying enough is enough, I'm going to shift. Where we have seen, especially in 2018, is a shift in the suburbs, and there was a lot of time and conversations about that in the news media, saying, okay, urban areas are Democrat and have been for my lifetime. Rural areas are predominantly Republican and have been for most of my lifetime. Really, the action here is in the suburbs, because the suburbs used to be Republican, all through George W. Bush and, even before. And there's, kind of this 1960s and 70s stereotype of the country club Republican, right? The white picket fence, a family of four who is upper middle class and goes to the country club and probably doesn't want their taxes raised, right? And this kind of fictional idea, people who fit somewhere in that or aspired to be in that demographic, were also white, right? Would vote Republican. And those white upper middle class college educated homeowners, right, have shifted to the Democrats in recent years. What we're seeing in the congressional results so far is that some of these districts have shifted back to the Republican columns, but it's very, very tight. So it's, I think, it basically means if it's a wave election for the Democrats, they'll probably win the suburbs everywhere, and if it's not, they'll win most of them, right? But you see, Trump, doing about as well in some of these areas as he did in 2016, and so we haven't fully gone over to seeing the suburbs be entirely Democratic. As one example, in Orange County in California, Orange County was where Richard Nixon was from, right? And this was, very heavily Republican territory. And you saw generations of Republicans come out of Orange County. And over time, the community has shifted. Some of the views have shifted, sure, but the community has changed as an influx of non-white, predominantly non-white immigrants from Southeast Asia have come in, and Latinx immigrants have moved, and the population has changed as it does everywhere. And you now see this changing demographic bearing fruit in terms of a change in political party registration, but more importantly, in terms of representation. And so in the last election in 2018, the Democrats swept out these veteran Republican lawmakers and brought in a new class of folks. But in this election, it looks like the Republicans clawed back at least one of those seats, with Young Kim, a Vietnamese Republican state lawmaker, winning on election day. So, I think it is really about changing demographics and changing, changing how people approach, their demographics and all of that. But we can't keep our eyes off of partisanship being the primary driver of how people vote. And so you're not going to see, like you did, I mentioned France earlier, right? You're not going to see kind of this broad repudiation where, one party gets, 60% plus of the vote. I don't think we're going to see that in the US, no matter how egregious the president is. We might see that in congressional races, but it's hard to imagine that as a country, just because of how strong partisanship is.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Carolyn, Jim, if I could interject one last 20-second piece.
Sure.
I realize Max and I talked a lot about just a lot of information, a lot of what's going on. But if I could leave one last piece with like, every young person needs to hold on to their hope right now. I think there's a lot of people who get really down about all this, down about climate change, down about all the information Max was talking about in great detail. And when you really understand this, it's hard to be like, wow, can I even do anything? And I think there's a big tear in our generation to be like, well, do I just go the normal course and get a good job and sort of focus on myself and just do that? And I would say, please don't. Please hold on to hope that we can make a change and that every individual can make an actual difference. And that when things may look hopeless as far as fixing problems, the worst thing you can do is give up. And especially the millennial generation and Gen Z, and this is for everybody listening and who will see this, like, please support the young generation in holding on hope to make change, because we don't have the luxury to go on with business as usual. People really do need to start changing their behaviors and really looking at things differently and engaging. And so again, if I can put my one last like passionate plea to everybody who sees this, like, just don't give up and keep pushing forward on what you know needs to happen to make a more sustainable world. So sorry.
Absolutely. And I was just gonna add one more statistic that I think's pertinent here, which is, in 2016, the young voter turnout was 16%, and young voters are defined as voters who are 18 to 29. So I have 6 more months of being a young voter. But, in this election, it looks like very strong returns from young voters, especially early returns. And even, as of election day itself was up to 17%, and more votes are coming in. So it is up. Every percentage is bigger. And, we have, we've had elections, for example, 2008, where, we are the margin of victory, younger voters, right? And this is really the first election that you're going to see Gen Z have an influence, right? The generation that's born in this millennium, that grew up, basically in the post 9/11 world, right? I mean, we're dealing with cataclysmic events now, right? But imagine someone who was born in 2000, where, if they have their earliest memories at age 3, 4, 5, 9/11 had already happened a couple of years before, right? For Jack and I, as in our late 20s, right, approaching our 30s, I remember 9/11. I was, we were in 4th grade, right? So for us, that was, partway through our life. We have many memories before 9/11. Sure, we weren't adults, but, we're born of a different time. The equivalent for us to 9/11 in terms of our lives, right, is the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, which happened soon after we were born. So, these events do shape people. It'll be interesting to see, how the events that we're experiencing right now, in terms of the pandemic, influence the people who are being born this year and in the last couple of years, in 18 plus years when they can vote, right? But this election is the first time we're seeing Gen Z, and they are a distinct, unique demographic that's experienced things in a different way than even the millennials have.
Good, thank you both. 2 bright young men, everyone. Wonderful to experience you. So, Carolyn, what's your? Let's start with what would be your comment on some of these issues that we've raised and we've discussed?
Well, I would like to provide a view from 35,000 feet, maybe a view that gives some perspective in terms of predicament. And I say that because there's a difference between problem and predicament. Problems are something we can solve, and we have lots of those, and there are some solutions for certain things. But what we're looking at overall is a predicament. And predicaments can't be solved, they can only be responded to. And that's why I've written so many books on the collapse of industrial civilization, because bottom line, that is what we're dealing with. And so I'd like to give some suggestions for how to move forward as we're dealing with this predicament. One is existentially to be practicing living with uncertainty. Now, we've been practicing a lot of that with the pandemic, just not knowing exactly what's happening and how long this is going to go on. And it's exceedingly difficult to practice being comfortable or living with uncertainty when we don't know an outcome. And we practice this by holding the tension of opposites. And what I mean by that is very practically, we look at what a Trump victory would feel like in our bodies. And then we look at what a Biden victory would feel like in our bodies. And we allow both feelings to exist alongside each other. Now, this is sometimes a torturous feeling. So we need to step back and step into a void of just not knowing and feel what that feels like. And then we engage in some radical self-care where we can escape the practice for a while and come back to it later. Alongside this, we take action. Are we willing to show up with what Brené Brown calls strong backs, soft fronts, and wild hearts to speak our truth when we can't control the outcome? Fighting for justice and peace, and also cultivating moments of joy and beauty. Holding the tension of opposites, as Margaret Wheatley writes, refusing to label ourselves as optimists or pessimists, but rather holding the paradoxes, living in the complexities and contradictions without needing to resolve them. That's the first perspective of uncertainty. And secondly, one that I feel very strongly is that we must confront what this election shows us about our cultural and personal shadow. On Facebook yesterday, someone posted a meme that said, "I don't ever want to hear someone say, 'This is not who we are,' ever again. This is very clearly who half of us are." And this is why 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Dark Gold, The Human Shadow and the Global Crisis. What does the closeness of this election say about our shadow? Another Facebook meme that I saw yesterday, someone said, "It shouldn't be this close. Not after caging children, not after selling out our soldiers, not after 230,000 people dead, not after 4 years of breaking every law on the books. It should not be this close." So even as we may cheer a Biden victory, there's enormous personal and cultural shadow healing work that needs to be done. Continuing to work on healing systemic racism, healing our greed and our sense of American superiority and exceptionalism, our tolerance of corruption, and so much more. That's the second perspective. And then finally, to really understand the collapse of industrial civilization and the paradigm on which it rests. This is not going to end because Biden is in the White House. It continues. The real question now is who's going to preside over the collapse and how? And for me, this helps create some distance and temper my attachment to outcome. I certainly want a more humane and compassionate person in charge as collapse unfolds. And that may be only a temporary arrangement if there is a Biden victory. But understanding that collapse has a life of its own is fundamental. I've written 12 books on how we can prepare emotionally and spiritually to navigate collapse. It is a rite of passage that we're now in. And learning how to engage with it as spiritual warriors in a planetary initiation is fundamental. And not only are we spiritual warriors, we're also called to be spiritual midwives, helping to birth a new human species. And Andrew Harvey and I are just about to release our new book, Radical Regeneration, Birthing the New Human in the Age of Extinction. So those are the three perspectives that I would offer at this moment from 35,000 feet, and for me and my belly sitting here on the earth in Boulder, Colorado.
Yes, from 35,000 feet and sitting on the earth simultaneously. Let me ask you a couple questions, Carolyn. The first on how do you relate the point that Jack was making earlier around millennials and people generally saying, I don't even know what's true. I can't believe in anything anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of the reality that we're in a post-truth world in a fundamental sense, with what you're calling for, where you hold the dilemmas, you hold the paradox. Where does one discern truth in a world in which truth has been deconstructed by strategic intent? How do you find truth?
Well, this is where the inner work and the inner relationship that we have with something greater than ourselves is so important. And so there's a certain amount of truth I can find out there in the world, and I respect that truth. But there's also truth that is in here. And the more I work with the truth that is in here and be able to resonate that with external truth, the less lost I'm going to feel. And so, as we navigate this chaos, we've got to have the inner grounding. We have to have spiritual practices. We have to have emotional tools that help us navigate all of this. Otherwise, we are totally lost. And why would you want to even continue living?
Yeah, I'm not sure that gets us to a notion of what's true. And I think that's what people are really desperate for. Again, back to Jack's point, climate change is simply true.
Yes.
It's
yes.
a fact.
Right.
But you have the president of the United States ridiculing climate change like he's ridiculing masks, mm-hmm. which are manifestly important with an airborne virus. Mm-hmm. How do you, within your sort of your cosmology, your sense of dilemma, your sense of paradox, where do you actually find what's true? Where's the climate change? Where's the kind of the rock upon which you can stand?
The rock on which I stand with climate change is science. And if you're going to reject science, if you're going to say, I'm just not going to listen to it because it's not true, then, I'm sorry, maybe there's nothing I can do to bring you back. If you're going to say, I'm not accepting the reality of COVID, it's not real, it's bullshit, then maybe you're going to have to get COVID to accept that it's real. Now, some people have gotten COVID from the science deniers. Some people have gotten COVID in that community and said, well, still not real. I had it. It was like a bad cold, But many people have gotten it and have died, or they've gotten very, very ill. And the long-term effects are horrific if you're left with long-term effects. Mm. And so, maybe it has to be about experience. But if you say, nothing's true, I don't know what I can do for you or with you.
Yeah, and that's important, because that leads to the point that Max was making. That last comment that Matt made, everyone, was pretty important. The parties aren't into persuasion because social media has already delivered the verdict in most people's minds.
Yeah.
And because people don't like cognitive dissonance, and social media is reinforcing what we're doing all the time to us, we're in these like little bubbles. So the notion of the going after the suburban women, that was beautiful, Max, because everybody else is accounted for, and then the parties realize that there's some softness with suburban women, and then all of a sudden the media, the social media bombardment starts on these poor women in the suburbs who are just kind of going along and minding their own business. And so you have a situation, Carolyn, of sort of exasperation. Well, if they don't understand, if they won't accept science, there's kind of nothing one can do. And so then that leaves us with the predicament of politics, is that only thing then is left is to get out the vote. And whoever can get out more people that believe in my world view, that's what's going to determine the election as we navigate through this, so that the notion of shadow is really complex, because in some ways we're all in the same psychological vice grip of reinforcing information, so that the shadow appears as the light.
Mhm. Mhm.
But what would be your comment on this? I mean, how do you deal with a political situation where everybody's made up their mind except for the suburban women, and so we're gonna go after them? And it's not to make a big difference; it's to make a 1 or 2% difference, to go over the edge, because as we're seeing in this election, all of them, it's like Biden or Trump, 50 point something percent, 48 point something percent. So the elections are fought in a narrow band of those undecideds.
Yeah.
Where's the shadow in that?
Well, the shadow has gotten us where we are, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it may be so big now that, as I've been talking about, that we're really in the collapse of our whole way of life, our whole industrial civilization, our Western civilization, that, a lot of things are beyond us now and have a life of their own. We can only do what we can do in our world to make a difference. And that might look very small, but it really does make a difference on some levels. And, I know I'm talking here to a bunch of activists, and I think we have to really give up our attachment to outcome. We do what we can do because it's the right thing to do, but we don't know where that's going to go. And so ultimately what we're really getting faced with, and I know millennials don't want to hear this, and I don't want to hear it either, is we're really faced with dealing with death. That's the ultimate outcome of the shadow. We're dealing with existential issues here, not just cultural issues. We're dealing with life and death, and we have been for a long time. What could be more obvious than COVID in terms of life and death? I don't know if I'm answering your question, Jim.
No, that's a very profound point that you're making. I mean, Plato said all philosophy is a contemplation on death, and the pandemic is putting death right in our faces.
Yeah.
And by a hair's breadth, we may escape Trump, but that is just an indication of how deeply our predicament goes.
Absolutely.
And so within that context, let me ask you a final question. Then I'd like to circle back to Jack and Max for some comments that you might want to make on where Jack ended up. Given everything that you know about collapse and sacred demise, Carolyn, what is the cornerstone of your hope?
The cornerstone
What's
of
the
my hope is
vision
that
that motivates you and gives you hope?
the cornerstone of my hope is that I am in a process called a planetary rite of passage. That's how I'm viewing everything these days. Every human being is in a planetary rite of passage, whether they know it or not. And so if you know that, then how do you respond? How do you live? What do you do? What is your purpose? Where do you find meaning is the big one. And that is what gives me life. That's where I come alive, is when I tap into my meaning. And that is all about service for me. That's all about plunging into joy and beauty and doing the best I can to make my world a more humane place, whether that looks like what Jack is doing, whether that looks like what Max is doing, you're doing, I'm doing, answering that call that is within us to find meaning and purpose at this time and make life better for all living beings.
There you go.
Outcome, I don't know. Outcome doesn't give me hope, but doing what I know is right to do, that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very important point there, that to first understand that the context
Yes.
is a radical transformation of every level, where something immense is dying,
Yep.
and something immense is being born.
Absolutely.
And within that context, living a life that gives you the deepest meaning. I think those are profound and sagacious words, Carolyn. So thank you for that. Then let's start with you, Max, and then Jack, and then Shelly. I'd love to have your comment on all these matters before we close today. Max, within the context of extraordinary transformation in every aspect of human society and life and ecology, where do you find meaning? Where do you find hope?
Well, I'm someone who has always had a strong connection to the natural world. So for me, if I'm in a place of despair or of, worry, I step out of, the indoors and into the outdoors in whatever way I can, whether that's a run in the woods or a camping trip with a friend, or, something that might be a little bit out of my everyday life, whether it's going skiing or rafting or, a backpacking trip in a new place, right? So finding that place of calm, as well as a place of connection to the natural world, helps rejuvenate me. I think that, where I find hope, touching on the previous conversation, where I find hope is in local actions. And so even though I've often been involved in national politics, and I was a delegate to the 2012 Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, and all of last year volunteered on Cory Booker's primary campaign for the president, very active, attending many events, and helped put on his largest event in California that was in Oakland in October 2019, and encouraging people to go out and vote and donate and volunteer for his campaign. I've always centered a lot of my work at the hyper local level, right? Helping people win races for school board, for city council, for water district, for healthcare district. Not every community in the United States has as many elected positions as California does. The West loves its elected officials. And so we have hundreds of them in every county, where even in places such as Marin County, where I live, we have 11 different cities, each with the city council for our 250,000 population county. On top of that, we have positions for such things as a sanitary district, right? So we're electing people to only oversee the sewer system. And so through those positions, through helping people get elected who share my values, I can help influence policies on really important issues that impact people's everyday lives and that impacts climate change in our natural world. Just as one example, in this election, we had a number of local races on the ballot in addition to our Congress member being up for re-election, of course, and the presidential. And we had a number of candidates step up to run who challenged political thinking, who were more creative in their outlook, who were newer faces on the scene. In some cases, they had run previously and lost, who were younger, who were more racially diverse in the most racially disparate county in California, which is Marin County. And overwhelmingly, this new brand of politics, this new progressive thinking, these candidates were the ones who won last night. One candidate who I was very proud to endorse and support, who's a dear friend, Chance Cutrano, came in first for town council in Fairfax. Fairfax is a small community, progressive thinking, good people on their city council. All three incumbent council members ran for re-election, and Chance challenged them. Another individual ran as well. Chance came in first. He came in ahead of all three incumbents. Good people, progressive people who are on the city council. The person who was most offering of a new vision, who was the most creative thinker, who had done incredible community work in Fairfax, but also deep thinking on the climate crisis and advocacy on Fairfax taking the leading role. That's the person who came in first. And so that gives me hope, is what we can do at the local level, whether it's a ballot measure, whether it's a community project, whether it's something that a business or nonprofit takes on, but also when it comes to elections and who we can elect at the local level and what they can accomplish just through the position locally that they can hold. So that really is what's given me hope in the political space.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, think global and act local, man. That's the bottom line. Jack, just a minute or two.
Yeah, of course. So I think really what has been driving me lately, it's funny, Max talks about getting out and like taking care of yourself and your body. And normally I'm a really big advocate of that, but lately I've actually been pushed to the limit where I'm like, I don't even have, when I'm out, when I'm sort of relaxing, when I'm doing things with friends, I'm still thinking about this and it's still coming up in conversation, and really, again, focus more on climate change. And to me, what has been my therapy has been diving even deeper into work and connecting myself with people and communities who are passionate about the work that I'm passionate about doing. And what really gives me hope is I actually dropped out of college studying political science because I realized I wasn't wired the same way Max was. I mean, he's done great in politics, but I had a different sort of lane that I needed to be in. And I found that lane within startups and technology. And the past 8.5 years have just dived deep into the early stage startup world and have found that I'm able to make a lot more of an impact in the world through startups and technology rather than politics. And of course, there's overlap in many areas now, but what really gives me hope is there's so much money in technology, and everybody knows this, and there's so much emphasis on go build the biggest, best billion-dollar company. All these investors, I mean, Jim, you're doing all the fundraising all the time, but these investors are like, oh, we're not interested in a $100 million company. We're only interested if you're building a $1 billion company. And I'm just like,
Really?
it's so backwards because it holds people back. I mean, I've pitched company ideas to investors of like corporate sustainable education. How do we develop sustainability programs that we can teach to the workforces at large corporations to help their bottom line and their ESG investing? And investors have blatantly been like, doesn't sound like there's a lot of money in that. Great idea, but the metrics aren't going to work. And I'm just like, why? And so the people who give me hope are the people in my industry who can fight against that and be like, you know what, we are going to build a sustainability company, and there's momentum building. There's more people who are like, yeah, I'm not going to build another CRM or another sales platform. Like, I'm going to go out and build a carbon sequestration data platform so companies can track how much carbon they're pulling down. And that, to me, the people who are fighting the status quo, the people who are saying, no more business as usual, we're going to do what we know we need to do. Those are the people I love connecting with. Those are the people who give me hope. Those are the people who sort of combat the voices in my head that sort of say, well, maybe it's time you just get a corporate sales job and do the regular path. And I want to be part of the guys who are part of the group of people who are making the change in the world, and we'll look back in 80 years and hopefully from a much more positive vantage point and say, you know what, I was on the front lines of making this positive change. So
Good. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. You guys are doing it, man. You are the revolution. Well done. Well done. I love the passion of the young. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Carolyn, I want to give you a chance for a final comment too, but I just got a question from David Stoney wondering if you could speak to the etymology of the term catastrophe.
I would love
think that may be the most apt description of the world in which we find ourselves, and then just round it off, just take a minute or two, no more, and then round it off with whatever you'd like to say.
Thank you.
Catastrophe.
Thank you for the question, David. I stole this, actually. I talk about it a lot, and actually the person who turned me on to this was Stephen Jenkinson when I interviewed him one time. And he broke down the word catastrophe, in terms of the prefix and the suffix. It's a Greek word that begins with kata, and kata means a going downward and inward, a descent. Strophe implies a weaving kind of action where you're doing this not alone. And so, the conclusion of Jenkinson, and I agree, was that we are going downward and inward as a species in a descent, but we need to do this together. And whatever the outcome, that this is our opportunity, this is our calling right now, to go downward and inward together, whatever the outcome may be, that changes us, that changes the others we're going downward with, and it may even change what is all around us.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, catastrophe is an opportunity to go down together. Yeah. And see what comes out the other side.
Absolutely.
Beautiful, beautiful. Shelly, final word.
I love everything I've heard today. And so much of it is so true that this is certainly not the end, but I'm always inspired by the idea that we can't learn how to live until we learn how to die. And I think that's absolutely true, that we have to dig into what is human, to use universal intellectual standards, to learn how to think, to continue to question. And when in doubt, side on the side of peace, side on the side of kindness, side on the side of compassion, side on the side of empathy. Often it's those very deep values that you have that can help you navigate through a myriad of choices that you're presented with. And if you don't know what to trust, then perhaps you should trust in yourself to do the right thing, not hurt others, concentrate on what's good, beautiful, true. Thank you so much, Carolyn and Jack and Max, for today. I look forward to being with you all tomorrow. We'll have some final thoughts and some final words as we continue to move through this week. And I just appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all.
Thank you, Shelly. And Jack, Max, Carolyn, this was a masterpiece. And I thank you all. And I think I'd like to close with just underscoring, Max, of something you said about getting out into nature. I think it's so critical for all of us as we go through this intensely human experience of Trump, Biden, politics, everything that we go through in our human constructed world, to realize we're being contained by the mother. And of utmost importance for all of us is to spend as much time as we can in nature, in a park, on the beach, climbing a mountain, taking a hike, getting out into the natural order of things, because it's the earth, it's Gaia that in the end is the container for human existence and human development, human catastrophe, and the meaning that we all seek. So I wanted to just bring that in at the end, because I think it's a fundamental point of our grounding. If we're going to go down together, we're going to end up in the earth. And it's our understanding that we are earth, and that everything we do, every choice we make, every conversation that we have is earth taking counsel with itself. We were produced by earth. And the greatest question any of us can ask is, why are we here? Why did earth produce us? And why are we here at this moment when all is being called into account? So Max, to watch the way you've thrown yourself into politics, I mean, you're so brilliant and elegant. I hope you get elected. I hope you go a long way and hit the top, man, because I can feel it burning inside you. And I just want to honor you and thank you for everything you're doing. And Jack, I love you. I love your enthusiasm, man. You make alive the word ebullient, and your joie de vivre is a beautiful thing to watch. With all the cynicism in the world, everyone, we're seeing today that life springs eternal with a purity and a heartfulness that will not be denied. And that, I think, is a source of hope. And Carolyn, you're an elder. You've seen it all. You know the etymology of catastrophe. And you still, every day, commit yourself to the human future with an integrity and a heartfulness that inspires us all who've read your books and seen your videos and have sat at your feet. So thank you for that. And Shelly, thank you for your daily commentary. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to cap off the week with Otto Scharmer, professor at MIT, with Joe Jaworski and others, the founder of the U process, U theory, pretty much what we've been discussing today is in the U process, in the U theory. You go down together, you sense in, and then you come out the other side. That's the journey. And Otto has written an extraordinary piece on the election that's been circulating around, and he's going to be speaking to us as we close out the week on the US election, and Shelly will be back again with us. So thank you, everyone. Beautiful session. We'll see you all again tomorrow, 5:00 p.m. Central European time here on Zoom. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.